This week here at the News Minute and News Laundry, we've published an extensive profile of Nikhil Kamath. If you don't know who he is, he's a 39-year-old billionaire from Bangalore. He's also the co-founder of Zerodha, and he's a very popular host of a podcast called WTF Is. Now, this is a profile written by my colleague Indulekha Aravind. She's joining us for this conversation, of course, and is behind a paywall. Many of us might be wondering why we've put this behind a paywall. To start off with, it's because Indu took almost 2 months to put this together. She had to speak to multiple people, multiple sources to piece together this entire profile, Nikhil Kamath's profile. Also, it is one of its kind because from what we know, there isn't another such profile of Nikhil Kamath. Though he is very much in public domain, there isn't an extensive profile. So you would want to read this. If you're somebody who follows startups or stock market or even, listen to his podcast week on week, and if it's just featured on your feed, you will find value in reading this profile. So as I keep reminding you, do become a subscriber of the News Minute and News Laundry. There is a QR code on your screen. You can scan it and become one, because not just will you get access to this profile, but also you'll get to read all our paywall stories, and you can also support independent journalism, because this profile, like other things that we do, it doesn't come from a place of vested interest. Indu has taken an honest look at his journey, where he started from, his motivation, why he did what he did, which is the most important question, because everywhere you'll find what he's done. But what led to these actions? That's the question we've tried to address in this profile. Now, Indu, I want to ask you, why did you choose to profile him? Because he's somebody very much in public domain. He's there on Instagram. There is so much talk about him already. So why did you think we need to look at him more closely?
That's actually a good question, Pooja, because when I reached out to his team initially for an interview, that's one of the things they asked me. Everything about him is out there, even the coffee he likes. So what more would you be adding to that? But I do hope I have done that in this profile that I hope you guys will read. But I set out to do this from, the basic motto for any journalist, which is curiosity. So I've tracked Zerodha and Nikhil Kamath a little bit, since for the last 10 years or so. I've interviewed Nitin a couple of times, written about them. But through all this, Zerodha was very much associated with Nikhil Kamath, the elder brother. He's older than Nikhil by 7 years. And he was very much the face of the company, which is fine, because if you look at any startup which has multiple founders, it's one person who is really the face of the company. But then after that, in the last couple of years, you suddenly have Nikhil Kamath exploding onto the scene. He's suddenly everywhere. He's held up as a philanthropist, as a youth icon. He's interviewing the Prime Minister, the CEO of Uber, Sam Altman, telling young entrepreneurs what they should be doing. And I felt that for someone who seems to have suddenly acquired a lot of influence, this would be a good time to take a closer look at his journey. Not the one that he's publicly spoken about, but, going beyond that, to look at the trajectory, the motivations, and the background in which it took place, even the arc of India's own transition over those years. I hope I've answered all those questions in my piece.
Yeah, I know. I've read it. I know she has. So you should go and read it. But, I know a lot of people, especially in Bangalore, but even other parts of South, across the country, who look up to Nikhil Kamath particularly. What is it that makes him that relatable figure, do you think? Is it because he came from a middle-class background, something that you address quite extensively in this article? But apart from that, what makes Nikhil Kamath a relatable figure for the youth of India?
One reason for his appeal among the youth is definitely, as you said, his origin story of the middle-class background. His dad was in a public sector bank. His mom was teaching the Veena. And especially so in a country like India, where, people who are managed to make it to the ranks of the wealthy and the famous and the influential invariably come from, generational wealth, and they have the privilege that comes with that. And and he also stands apart in that he was a school dropout, unlike other startup founders who we see who are typically from IITs, etc. And the other reason, of course, is that he's the co-founder of Zerodha, which stands out among startups in India for being very profitable and profitable throughout. And secondly, for not having taken any external funding or any VC money, which is very much a part of its brand and identity. So it's this whole story of this, self-made billionaire who's come from a very relatable background, which appeals to people. Then, of course, there is the part where his the reach of his podcast, which is very influential, and where he's if you look at some of the other podcasts in this genre, it's also about how young people can make it big, what they should be doing, and that's definitely one of the things that he addresses through his the different episodes. Like what if you are a 22-year-old founder in India, what sectors should you be looking at, or how should you approach it, which is something that would I think be useful to anyone kind of listening to it or interested in it.
Apart from the fact that he's a self-made billionaire now, one thing I didn't know well enough and I found in this piece is that he's a school dropout. He wasn't this topper or highly accomplished academic or anyone who made it big. So do you think that is one of the things that sets him apart, or did you find other such things through the course of your reporting?
That's actually a interesting nuance in his journey, because so one, it's definitely unusual in the startup ecosystem, because if you look at the big startups that we know of today, the founders, a lot of them would be from IITs or similar elite engineering institutes. And the other thing, of course, is the word dropout and the connotation that has in the whole Silicon Valley culture, which is very much emulated and reflected in Bangalore. So in Silicon Valley, you have, even though it is the rare exception, the person who drops out of college and makes it to the ranks of the rich and the famous. But that's really kind of mythologized. You have people like Bill Gates, you have Peter Thiel, who kind of advocates for that. So that's a very, it's an interesting kind of identity to lean into. And it's something that he has. He's never, because at the time that he dropped out and the background that he comes from, it would have been a difficult choice, especially to drop out of school, not even college. But if you look at it, he's gone on to embrace the tag of being a dropout, not some. He's spoken about not of missing out the whole college experience, but otherwise it's a brand that he's kind of embraced. And but we should remember that it's always the exception, and that's not the norm. That if you and to be fair, it's not that he is endorsed dropping out either, but yeah, for people watching, that's probably good to kind of keep.
Yeah, I was worried that we don't want young people thinking that let's become Nikhil Kamath by dropping out of school. No, that doesn't happen to everyone. You still need to finish your education. So that's that. But what is also striking is there are some 200 billionaires in India today. He's the only one who has a podcast of his own. And like you said earlier, he's interviewed Prime Minister Modi, so many other influential people. Why do you think, what drove him to start a podcast?
So if we look at, the ecosystem of the wealthy in India, especially if you look at old money, definitely you don't have people like Mukesh Ambani or Gautam Adani starting their own podcast or hosting one. That's not something that's I guess part of their brand. But if you look at Silicon Valley, there you see how popular this whole idea of having your own podcast, especially video podcasts, has become, and how that's a very key part of your brand building and personal branding. In fact, one of the people I interviewed, communications consultant Karthik Srinivasan, he was joking that every founder these days either has a podcast or they'll be on another founder's podcast, because that's seen as so while we've always had startup founders trying to make use of social media like LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. Podcast is something that requires more investment, more effort. It's not something that everyone can do. And if you're good at it, that will really give you a kind of cachet that you won't get otherwise. And it's something that Nikhil has cracked very well. And the other interesting thing that I came across is I spoke to Nikhil Taneja of the organization Yuva, which works a lot with young people in India. And he was saying that today, it's such an important part of acquiring influence, this whole, having a podcast where you speak directly to people. So even if you have creators trying to be entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs trying to be creators, because podcasters are also creators, right? And even if you are, if you're rich and you're famous, the kind of reach that you get through social media, through podcasts, that's different, and that's something that anyone would want.
Yeah. You mentioned old money and old timers like an Ambani or an Adani. They don't put themselves out there as much. You don't know what their opinion on 100 things are. Every communication is usually more curated, very controlled, the narrative, which is, at least it doesn't seem to be the case in Nikhil. Is that a deliberate strategy to make himself seem more accessible, somebody who has an opinion? So in that sense, he becomes an opinion shaper of the young generation? Or that's who he is, that's part of the whole personality?
It's, I like that you said seem to be more accessible because that's definitely the image that's out there and that he's successfully been able to create, which is what something like a podcast allows you to do, right? It allows you to speak to people directly without the mediation of, say, someone like us, for instance, us journalists. But again, it also simultaneously gives you control over the message that you want to shape, right? Because if it's your podcast, you get to ask the questions, or you get to control the whole narrative, how you are with your guests. I mean, you can edit, etc., etc. So, I would think that it's a very strategic and clever move on his part to embark on this path of being a podcaster, and he's done it quite successfully.
Yeah, his podcast gets lakhs of views. By the way, if you're watching this, I must plug South Central, which is our podcast. We don't get lakhs of views just yet, but do go and check it out on our YouTube page, on our homepage as well. We take up a whole bunch of topics and discuss it in great length. My plug is over. But he's also associated himself with many causes, right? And he's someone who's built this entire ecosystem of philanthropy. How does that fit with his whole image?
That's again, I feel something that he did deliberately, and which has worked well on his, for his brand. So as when we started speaking initially, I spoke about how he was kind of in the background and he suddenly seemed to have burst on the scene. But when I was looking at the trajectory of his journey, it emerged that around 2019, 2020 is when he seemed to have, there seemed to have been like a deliberate messaging around his brand and his identity, which is separate from Nikhil Kamath and Zerodha, while also obviously riding on the the brand that Zerodha and Nitin had built. So one of and as part of this whole brand building, he also took the help of a very well-known publicist who I spoke to. You can read the story to find out the details about what he said and the role that he played. But you'll notice around that time that there was a whole bunch of articles in the foreign media on international podcasts about this billionaire who dropped out of school to play chess and then became a trader, which is a great narrative to push at that point. So his tryst with chess didn't end very well, which is something that I've gone into in the piece as well, especially his possible motivations behind it. But the other kind of track that they pushed was his philanthropy, and he set up this Young India philanthropic pledge for the wealthy under 45 years of age who would commit to giving away 25% of their wealth. Then very importantly, he signed up for the Giving Pledge, which was it's a very high-profile philanthropic endeavor set up by Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and his Bill Gates' wife at the time. And that, the other people in India who've signed up are people like Nandan Nilekani, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, incidentally, one of his friends. So that would, put you into a whole, another level of, I'd say, influence and network. To be fair, Nikhil has been candid about whenever he's been asked in interviews about his motivations for philanthropy. He's said a couple of times that it's not about altruism. He's, it's something people do to feel good about themselves, and that philanthropy has come to be seen as cool. And he likes the world that he moves in because of that, which I thought that was an interesting peek into his mind.
Yeah. But you mentioned that Kiran Mazumdar is one of his friends. It's a very unlikely friendship in that sense, and something you've gone into in the piece. How difficult was it to speak to people close to him, or people who've seen his journey? And what were the challenges you found? Because, like I said, it did take 2 months, and that's because you were trying to speak to so many people. So what was the difficult part of writing this profile?
The biggest challenge was that Nikhil didn't speak to me despite multiple attempts. Initially, it was that he was traveling, and but then once I think I shared what the kind of things that I'd be covering in the story. Anyway, for whatever reason, he declined to be interviewed. Which is disappointing, because I would have loved to have his response to some of the things that I found out, which some people told me in the course of reporting. But I believe that that does not take away from the story significantly, because I was able to speak to friends going back to his childhood, friends of Nitin's employees who'd worked in Zerodha in the early days. Others who didn't want to be quoted, people who worked with him in different phases of life. And one of the things that I've gone into in the story is his, when I mentioned earlier that 2019, 2020 is when his image seemed to get a kind of boost. And that coincided with the launch of True Beacon, which was launched by the Kamaths, but Nikhil was very much the face of it. So if you see these days, True Beacon is not something that's associated with Nikhil. Is not something that he speaks about very often, where he's even while he speaks about a lot of other things and a lot of the other investments that he makes, etc. And that's one of the things that I've gone into in the story and explored about whether it's been a success or not.
I don't want to give it all away, but let's end this conversation with the kind of influence that he now has because of his businesses, because of his podcast or whatever else. What did you find?
It's definitely his podcast that has elevated him to, I would say, a whole different sphere of influence, because we, as you mentioned, we have plenty of billionaires in India, but not everyone can boast of the kind of network and connections that he's been able to build. And one of the things that drew my attention to Nikhil, in fact, and which pushed me to do the story, was the fact that, Pooja, if you recall the last elections, we had, unlike the previous ones, we had quite a few prominent figures giving interviews to influencers on podcasts, both from, across parties. But earlier this year, we saw that the Prime Minister, when for the first time he gave when he was on a podcast, it was not to any of the, professional influencers, but it was on Nikhil Kamath's podcast, which I thought was very interesting and was a signal to, what that there might be something beyond that. And so when I went back to look at, that equation a little bit, I saw, a couple of things, of course, was the fact that going back to 2023, when we had the Karnataka Assembly elections, one of the people that Modi met was again Nikhil and Nitin Kamath, and Nikhil had put up a very effusive tweet after that. He I mean, there are a couple of other instances as well, which I've mentioned in the story, but that also, if you look at the kind of some of the messaging that he's been doing through the very powerful, the influential platform that he has, some of it I would say would echo what the government has also been saying. And that's in fact one of the important questions, right? Once you build up a platform, once you have influence, what do you use it for? How are you using it? How are you wielding the power that it has given you? So yeah, that's one of the things I've written about as well, and I do hope everyone watching this will subscribe and read the piece. I'd love for as many people as possible to read it and obviously support free and independent media.
Yeah, I hope people will now sign in and read it. It's always a challenge to write about somebody who's already out there, who's, people seem to know everything about him, but there's so much more that you don't know. And with that, like Indu said, she's also traced the arc of India's growth, the financial growth. It's a very interesting read. So I urge you to become a subscriber, go and read it, because these stories are important. It can't just be narration of one person, two people, but it's actually brought together multiple voices. So do read Indu's piece. She's somebody who knows what she's talking about. She's been a business journalist for a long, long time. So she brings that seniority to this piece. So with that, I leave you. Become a subscriber as we keep reminding you of the News Minute and News Laundry. You get to read this piece and all our paywall content. Thank you.